Hello everybody, it's me, Tall23 back in another video. In this video, I'm going to be doing a book review of a book which I've been reading for the last couple weeks, because why not? I picked up this book about a month ago at Barnes & Noble. It's called The Case for Christ. It's actually kind of well known among Christians, and this is the special movie edition based on the movie that was made in 2017. But really the only difference between this and the original book, I think, is the interview at the end of the book with the author. And the author is Lee Strobel, who was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune in the 70s and 80s. He was an atheist, he was a skeptic who did not believe the claims of Christianity, but when his wife converted to Christianity, he wanted to investigate the veracity of the Gospels and the story of Jesus, because he basically wanted to debunk it. So that was what he went out to do. He sought for looking for answers to see whether or not Christianity was true, so he could just turn his wife away from that. But after a 2-year investigative journey where he interviewed multiple scholars on the New Testament and the truth of the claims of the apostles and whether or not Jesus resurrected from the dead and so on, after that 2-year journey, he converted to Christianity in November of 1981 upon seeing the fact that there's substantial evidence that what the Bible says is right. And he wrote this book a number of years later, basically retracing his steps and going over the interviews which he had and performing new interviews with those same scholars in order to, I guess, write this book and present all the facts even clearer. So I read this book. I didn't know what it was going to be like exactly or what it was going to say. It's kind of interesting. There are some things in here which I like. There are some things which I don't like. And that this is more just my personal opinion. When it comes to something which is presented as a nonfiction book, which is giving historical, theological facts and things like that, I expect it to be mostly informational. That's just my kind of deal. I like reading things that are very technical, that just explain it and don't go into a lot of detail about the surroundings or anything like that. It seems like in every chapter, when he sits down with the scholar he's about to interview, before he gets in the interview, and this literally happens in pretty much every interview, he describes the office of the person. He's like, "Oh, I pulled up to their office," then he describes the person. "Oh, they have black hair that's combed back, and they're wearing glasses, and even describes like the sweater and everything." It's like, it's really unnecessary. So it takes up a lot of space. Sometimes he's just describing the papers and the pictures on their desk. So that's one thing that I don't really like about it. But when it comes to the actual information, I think some of it's interesting. A lot of it's repetitive. For example, they keep talking about 1 Corinthians 15 throughout the entire thing, which is an important passage in the Bible, the first 4 verses of 1 Corinthians 15, but I don't think you should base the entire argument off of the fact that 1 Corinthians 15 was an early church creed, which they prove in this book. So that's another thing. Just the chapters, I guess. It has a pretty good layout. First is the eyewitness evidence, testing it, the documentary evidence, the corroborating evidence, etc. So the corroborating evidence part talks about the evidence outside of the Gospels from ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus. And because this book was written in 1998 and was based mostly on interviews that were done before that, I think that there's a lot of information which is left out and could be expanded upon, but for the most part, I think this is very convincing. And at least it helps me understand, it can be sure more of the claims of the Gospels. Now, I'm already sure of that because I have assurance of salvation, but there's some good arguments in here that are made. For the most part, it's just kind of boring a little bit, just, I don't know how else to describe it. So if you read this book, just try and just get through the parts that are just repetitive and I guess don't really need to be there, just tedious, trivial little details just all over the place. It's just, yeah. So I finished this book yesterday with the last section. I didn't read the interview, but the last section before that is just a summary. It's the conclusion, the verdict, where Lee Strobel goes over each of the points, each of the questions which he asked, and the evidence which they give. And when you put it all together, it makes perfect sense. I mean, he could have just explained all of it in one. Again, I'm not really trying to complain. I'm just giving suggestions and I guess reviewing it. I don't know. I don't really do book reviews or anything, so this is not my thing. This is not my style. I'm just talking about it, discussing my experience reading it and what I think about it, which I guess would be a review. So, yeah, you could just these last 10 or 12 pages or so, 10 to 12 pages, where he just goes over the basic evidence and he just summarizes basically everything he said before that. So yeah, there's some interesting information in here. That there's some people. Oh, one thing also, which I think is kind of I don't know how to describe it. It's unnecessary. Is the fact that it seems like Lee Strobel is really trying to just emphasize the fact that the people he's interviewing are scholars. Like, he's being kind of annoying about it, honestly, in this book. Like, every time he finds, like, the people he interviews include Craig Blomberg, Bruce Metzger, Edwin Yamuchi, John McRae. Before I read this book, I've heard of Bruce Metzger, John McRae, and heard of D.A. Carson and William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas, but everybody else is pretty new to me. But every time he, like I said, with not just describing their physical appearance in their office, but he just says, oh, this person is super qualified to talk about who they are. They're just scholars. They have like 5 degrees. They're a doctor. They are on all these college boards. He just lists every single book and article that they've written, all the debates that they've been in, and everything like that. He's like trying to stretch out the fact that they're trying to say, well, look at how intelligent they are, then they must be right. That doesn't necessarily mean that they know what they're talking about, because people can lie. And I'm not saying that they are. I'm just saying that I think it's kind of unnecessary to repeatedly say every single time a scholar comes up that they're a scholar. I mean, you can just put the fact, what's like William Lane Craig, PhD or whatever. You don't have to say William Lane Craig, PhD, and then talk for the next 5 paragraphs about how he's written all these books and he has all these degrees and he's a board member for these universities and he's a professor and he has all these organizations and everything like that. I mean, it's just kind of annoying, to be honest, but I know it sounds like I'm trying to sounds like I'm being negative about it. I don't know. I don't really know what positive things to say about it, except for it gives some good evidence for the resurrection, for the crucifixion of Christ. And that's probably one of my favorite chapters, one of the most eye-opening chapters in the book, when he interviews Alexander Metherell, who is an actual doctor, a physician, and he talks about the effects of crucifixion on the body, the effects of flogging. Talks about how Jesus went into hypovolemic shock, pleural effusion around the lungs, and how the detail of blood and water coming out of Jesus' side at the crucifixion, how that is a detail which supports the historical Jesus, because it shows that this is something which happens, because we know from modern medical evidence and research that when somebody goes into hypovolemic shocks, fluid gathers around their heart and around their lungs. So when his side was pierced, that's why the water came out. So that was a very interesting chapter, and it really opened up my eyes to see just how much suffering Jesus went through. And recently I've also been looking a lot into Isaiah chapter 52 and 53 as well, which it says in Isaiah 52, it's talking about the prophecy of Jesus. It says that his vision was so marred more than any other man, because crucifixion is truly one of the most cruel and I guess just painful execution methods in history. It really just destroys your body, and his visage was so marred more than any other man, and we can see this in this book. So overall, if I were to rate this out of 10 or something like that, I would rate it like a 7 out of 10. Of course, taking the points off for just the it's really drawn out, and there's a lot of times where they don't get straight to the point, or and I guess a lot of the time it's not really Lee Strobel's fault either, because the majority of it is interviews. He's interviewing somebody, so one of these scholars or whatever, and he says, okay, well, what about this? And he raises up a question, and then they answer, and their answer is like a sentence or two. And then later in the chapter, he raises the question again, or he says, well, you need to go into a little more detail. And then they go into like a page of detail. It's really strange how it's structured, and I wonder why these people were so vague if they're scholars. Some of them weren't. Some of them were super specific, but I think William Lane Craig was kind of vague. Gary Habermas seemed kind of vague too. There's some other people who just didn't really seem to be specific with what they were talking about. So it's kind of just mixed. There's some good things about this book. There's some bad things. Right here it says pros, and over here it says cons. There are some pros and cons about the book. So thank everybody for watching. That's all I have to say, I guess. So overall, it's a pretty good book. There are some bad things about it, I guess, but the message of the book, the purpose of it, is very important, and I would suggest for people to at least read this and to give it a chance to see the evidence for the crucifixion, for the resurrection, for the veracity of the Gospels, and for the context surrounding that and everything that happened in the early church. That isn't just a legend that was made up decades or centuries after Christ. And I've talked about these things on my channel before, but this just goes over it in a lot more detail about the points which I've made in some of my videos. So thank everybody for watching, and goodbye.